From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome. This is the Whitall Pavilion. It's wonderful, of course. Thank you all for being here in the middle of the day, especially those of you who are not library employees. There are a good many of you here, so that's really great to see. My name is Nicholas Brown. I am a music specialist in the music division, where I'm on the team with the concert office, programming the concert series and the various public programs that we do around that. One of my great pleasures of working here is to engage in one of my other passions, which is musicological research. And today I'm very excited to share some of the results of that with you. And this has been a topic that I've been looking into for many years, even back when I was coming to the library to do research as a student. So the title of the talk is Hindemiths Musical Responses to World War I. Before we get started, just want to give a shout out to the Interpretive Programs Office because this lecture is part of the programming for 2 World War I exhibits that the library has going on. One of them is open right now, and the next one opens up on April 4th. The exhibits are titled World War I American Artists View the Great War, and the second one is Echoes of the Great War, American Experiences of World War I. So check that out. You're all invited to take your phones out and live tweet this talk. You can also take pictures of the collection items and put them up on Instagram or wherever else you would like. Please tag the library when you do that, at Library Congress. And you're also invited to use the hashtag World War I, WWI, and my personal handle is there for Twitter if you would like to tag me as well. Great. So this is a quote by one of Hindemith's principal biographers, and you can read it, but I will read it as well. He was never a patriot, yet he was deeply attached to his German roots, and the true test came when his country was taken over by a totalitarian regime. So that kind of introduces this biographical narrative that's going on in Hindemith's life. So he grew up and came of age in the World War I period, and then had significant conflict with the regime during the Nazi period, which then drove his departure from Germany. Eventually went to Switzerland, came to the US, and made his way back later on. But the purpose of this talk is very much to take a close dive just on the World War I period and the years immediately following, where Germany and Hindemith were very much trying to put things back together, because Germany, of course, was a mess for several years there after the war. So this is a wonderful picture of Hindemith in uniform in World War I with his viola. It's from 1918. I couldn't come up with a clever enough viola joke, so you're allowed to put your own in, and there's a space there for that. So while you are checking out Hindemith, I'll just give you a bit of an overview of his biography for those of you who aren't so familiar with him. And then after that, we're going to shed some light on some of his role in World War I and some of the music that he composed during the period. And we'll also do a close reading of one of his World War I era response works. And then we'll discuss Hindemith's relationship to the library, because that's the only reason I'm allowed to talk about him, because he had a relationship and we have collections that are related to Hindemith. So there's Hindemith in a string quartet. I'll get to this in the narrative, so just peruse that while I give you some tidbits. So Hindemith was born in Hanau in Germany near Frankfurt on November 16th, 1895. He died also in Frankfurt in 1963. He was the oldest of 3 siblings, learned the violin first, then he started studying composition at the Hoch Conservatory in Frankfurt. One of his teachers was Arnold Mendelssohn, who is the great-nephew of Felix. He was also the same teacher of Adorno, which I find very interesting. Hindemith didn't stick with the violin, and he later switched over to viola and became a composer, of course. He was a significant music theorist, an educator, and a conductor. He also published many important theoretical treatises and some pedagogical texts as well. So getting into the World War I time frame, that was a very brief overview of his biography. Go read something. You don't want to hear me ramble on about that all day. So World War I. So Hindemith's father, Robert Rudolf Emil Hindemith, who was born in 1870, was the one of the driving forces behind Hindemith becoming a musician. He was a musician. He forced his children to pretty much get in the track to become musicians. He was very active in getting Hindemith opportunities with teachers, putting him into conservatories with scholarships, and even opening the door for jobs. Just about the time of 1914, the relationship soured. I haven't gotten in enough depth in the German text to see exactly why that was. And it seemed like Hindemith probably didn't talk too much about it. But right about the time that they became estranged, Hindemith's father went off to fight in World War I. This is in 1914. And he was killed within that first year of conflict. So that left Hindemith's mother without the income for the household, and Hindemith had to quickly adapt to become the principal breadwinner for the family. He joined the Frankfurt Opera Orchestra in 1914. He was promoted to deputy leader or deputy concertmaster later that year, and he became the concertmaster in 1917. Hindemith was very involved in chamber music playing, notably joining the Rebner String Quartet from 1915 as the second violinist, and later in 1923 was the switch to viola that we mentioned earlier. So Hindemith was busy working in Frankfurt. He was a freelancer. He also had these permanent gigs where he was relatively well paid compared to a lot of other people. And he kind of got away with not having been conscripted initially because there was a draft. One of the biographers goes in depth into something that really puts the effect of World War I into perspective. So Hindemith, at the outset of the war, had a lot of German nationalist kind of concepts, not super nationalist, not super imperialist like other folks, but you can see his attitude towards the war and towards his own government's positions evolve over the course of the war. So on September 23rd, 1914, Hindemith said, quote, "Everyone is glad that the French are getting a good blow, and if one goes into town towards noon or in the evening, there's a crowd such as one seldom notices in peaceful times. In the entire empire, there is the greatest optimism that Germany will win. And when you see all the happy soldiers who are still here and the enthusiasm, you know this cannot be otherwise. Everyone is delighted to go into the field, and when you see that everyone is happy to grab a weapon and no one wants to stay behind, even enemies will have to admit that the German people are fighting for a just cause and have not, as the French, Russian, and English lie factories wish to propagate, gone to war just for rowdiness. Don't think that what I'm writing is an exaggeration. The numbers are set too low. The people are in a state of enormous enthusiasm." Obviously, that didn't last for most people in the Central Powers there, just given the scale of destruction and death. Hindemith was initially called out for service in 1915, but he was rejected. And he wrote of this to some friends, quote, "They haven't yet taken me up into the ranks of the defenders of our country, and I'm not angry about it. I was examined twice, but was rejected due to general physical weakness and heart defects. There will probably be more examinations coming up, and I have no hope of coming back again." So that's within a year. He's from September 14 to September 15, his attitude has switched. And maybe there was other context going on, but that's what we have in some correspondence to go off of. So he was eventually conscripted in August of 1917, and throughout these first few years of the war, he was just in Frankfurt working, basically. His training period started in August 1917, and then in January 1918, he was sent close to the front in Alsace with a regiment, and then eventually on to Flanders in the summer of 1918. One of the things that shows Hindemith's entrepreneurial skill or persuasive skills is that he lobbied the director of the Frankfurt Opera Theater to keep him on salary in his position while he was off fighting. So nowadays, if you're in the military and you work for the government, you have 15 days of military leave a year, which is very generous. And so you're basically getting paid leave time to be in service, but it expires at a certain point. So Hindemith actually negotiated to get 70% of his salary paid while he was away and not working for the opera orchestra, which was pretty cool. And his boss there was generous and didn't seem to put up much of a fight about that, given that he very much asked for empathy because of his mother's situation and not having the father anymore. So in the war, Hindemith was assigned to the regimental band. This is a good place for professional musicians to go during sort of total war situations. It's the same in the American military in World War I or World War II, folks like Glenn Miller serving Elvis doing his little PR service, right? And Hindemith, because it was basically a brass and percussion sort of drum and bugle corps kind of ensemble, he played bass drum. There was not an opportunity for him to play the violin at his initial entry to the regimental band. He kind of seems to have appreciated that he was in a cushy service job, basically. And he wrote to some friends in May of 1918, quote, "I can hardly imagine most musicians as soldiers. Bach as a staff sergeant, that would still be okay. But Beethoven practicing rifle drill, Mozart throwing hand grenades or standing guard in front of a barracks, Schubert as an Air Force lieutenant, and Mendelssohn as an NCO at a vehicle fleet convoy. That is inconceivable," end quote. So Hindemith did have downtime in which to compose, and very quickly after he got tired of playing bass drum alone, he joined in a string quartet with some others in the military service, and that became a big part of his duties, was to play string quartet repertoire for their commanding officer, who was a very sort of well-read, learned type of guy who enjoyed his classical music, and that was a really good opportunity for Hindemith to take advantage of. So they were mostly back from the front lines as a result of his entertainment role and ceremonial role. And eventually, they did get sent into sort of guards situations, which I'll get into in a second. But at one of the evenings or days when he was performing for the commanding officer in the string quartet, they happened to be performing Debussy's quartet. And while they were performing it, they got word that Debussy had passed away. This was in 1918. March 25th was when he passed away. Hindemith, is one of his most well-known quotes is the following, quote, "We did not play to the end." This is referring to that performance of the Debussy. "It was as if our playing had been robbed of the breath of life, but we realized for the first time that music is more than style, technique, and the expression of powerful feelings. Music reached out beyond political boundaries, national hatred, and the horrors of war. On no other occasion have I seen so clearly what direction music must take." So that definitely shows to us, I think, that Hindemith was a very enlightened individual. He was thinking about what he was experiencing. And this kind of discourse on the role of the music in these conflict situations, it plays an interesting role in the rest of his life. And this is very much the formative period with this, because he got into conflicts, of course, with the Nazis later on in terms of his positions in the conservatory and advocating for composers who were being pushed out for political or religious reasons. So this is the foundation of Hindemith as the sort of noble intellectual standing up for what's right through his music. He wasn't a radical with it at all. It's more, it fits into this concept of expressionism, where he was using the music to give a very individualized accounting of emotions and personal responses, especially through the text-based works, the vocal chamber music, which we're going to get into in depth. One other joke that he made about the bass drum in his time of service was, quote, "I was assured that this instrument had never before been treated so rhythmically. Service is not so hard. I have a lot of free time and can work on what I want," end quote. So later in the war, in May of 1918, in Flanders, where he was stationed, he writes about his experiences of being really on the front lines rather than several kilometers back before, right? If you're playing a string quartet while people are dying, you're probably not on the front lines. So he writes of being closer to the combat situation, quote, "Towards the evening, 8 bombs were thrown near the town. One hit the ammunition convoy that bivouacked 10 minutes away from us. A horrible sight. Blood, bodies full of holes, brain, a torn off horse's head, splintered bones. Dreadful. How mean and indifferent one becomes. I don't think I could have eaten or worked in peace before seeing such a sight. After seeing such a sight. And now one sits at home again, writing, chatting, in a good mood, not thinking about how soon the bell could toll for us. It's gradually becoming creepy here. Are we going to withdraw unharmed?" So there's a lot of different emotions going on, right? He's going from being in a pretty protected situation to being more towards the combat experience, seeing what's going on. And I think a lot of the concepts that he's reflecting on in that statement in terms of experiencing and witnessing visually the gore and the death come through in a lot of the texts that he selected for his musical compositions. When he heard of the end of the war in November of 1918, he described the experience of hearing the news as an event that I shall never forget for the rest of my life. And after that point, he went back to Frankfurt to continue composing, and he took back his position in the opera orchestra. This is another interesting quote that a musicologist wrote about Hindemith in a 1929 biographical account in Music and Letters. And it reads, "The mentality of Hindemith is definitely of the present and not of the past. He follows the events and happenings of the world about him and makes use of contemporary methods of thought and expression, but never drifts into a mere mouthpiece for his generation. His personal equation is too strong." This is a scan of Hindemith's military passport from 1918 that the Hindemith Foundation has digitized, which is pretty interesting. And this is that quote regarding the WC. So to describe his compositional output during and around World War I, there were kind of three groups that I'm referring to the pieces as. The first group is vocal chamber music, which might be voice and piano, or it might be voice and chamber ensemble with multiple instruments. There's also instrumental music that did not have a specific program associated with it, which he had several of. One is the Andante und Scherzo for clarinet, horn, and piano from 1914. That's his opus 1. That manuscript is lost. There are 3 of his works from this period which are lost within this instrumental chamber category. He composed his first 2 string quartets during the war, the first one in 1915 and the second one in 1918. That one was fully composed while he was out in service in Flanders. He also composed a piano quintet in 1917, a sonata for flute, clarinet, bass clarinet, horn, bassoon, and string quintet in 1917. 3 pieces for cello and piano in 1917, sonata for violin, opus 11-6, a couple other sonatas for violin, and a handful of solo piano works. Of the orchestral works, this was very much the least of his focus, I think. In this period, the first orchestral work during the World War I period was the Cello Concerto in E-flat, opus 3, completed in 1915-1916. A Lustige Sinfonietta for small orchestra, opus 4. And then in the 1920s was really when he delved into the Kammermusik series, which are the sort of chamber orchestra or large chamber ensemble-sized works, which kind of served to juxtapose the more text-specific vocal works and then his sort of trying to think of things maybe more in the abstract or be more objective. There's a lot about Hindemith that's conflicting in terms of what he's trying to do. So at the same time as he had these really kind of dark, grim vocal works that are setting the text of like Rilke and Trakl, who we'll get to, he's also churning out instrumental music that doesn't seem necessarily to be saying as much. And there might be reasons for that, which we will get into in a moment. He also set, interestingly, this was the one exception to this non-crossover business between genres, some Whitman poetry throughout his life. In the Revolutionary Hymn, which he used, he also used the same musical theme from that vocal setting in the string quartet opus 16, which is interesting, I think. The Rilke poetry that he got into differed from the expressionist folks like Trakl in that it was seeking to go more after this new objectivity movement rather than the expressionist movement. So we have this juxtaposition of let's look inward, let's tell our personal experience, or let's convey the experience of a figure in the text to this quote-unquote objective music that seems to ignore what's actually going on in society. And maybe he's making a commentary on the way that some parts of society ignore what's actually going on, regardless of maybe because of their position in society, and then others being much more directly affected. One of the great quotes from the Fraser biographical account from Music and Letters was that Hindemith sought to bring art down to the level of life and to raise life to the level of art. So there's this constant struggle between where the music is being positioned in terms of relevance for himself and also for his audiences. The specific works that we're going to get into from the Expressionist period represent a response to what Encyclopedia Britannica calls the chaos and suffering of modern life. There's a lot of references to colors in the texts, which may or may not have relevance to text painting, but I think in one of the songs that we're going to hear, there's this reference to the color red over and over throughout the movements as this woman becomes completely sucked into the morbidity of the situation in Germany. And the red is representing this figure that's almost like death or the Grim Reaper coming in the form of a little boy, which is kind of creepy. The new objectivity works are very much the transition away from this expressionist work that he did. So very much from the string quartets from the 1920s, and then the first Kammermusik, Opus 24 in 1922. And you'll see in the sequencing of the pieces that we're looking at, some of the expressionist stuff was overlapping with this new objectivity business. So that's the sort of cross currents happening simultaneously. Some of the concepts that Hindemith addresses in the World War I text settings come up again and again in some of his more famous works from later in his career, including Matthias der Maler, which tells the story of Matthias Grunewald, the painter, and Die Harmonie der Welt, which tells the story about Kepler. Both of those operas deal with the conflict of the individual identity and the sort of situation of social upheaval, regardless of the context. So I think Hindemith, throughout his career, even though he didn't spend all of his time focusing on social issues in his music, there's definitely this thing about him that sticks to that topic, whether it's specific to World War I experiences, whether it's revisiting historical figures and seeing how history repeats itself, unfortunately. And the two figures that were chosen for those opera settings were described as his two heroes in history. So that definitely, I think, shows that he's thinking about these issues on a long-term basis. The particular use of the vocal music to get across some kind of social commentary is a result of Hindemith's thinking that the voice was, quote, perhaps the most natural of musical utterances, end quote. So there's a definite sense that he can do something more with the vocal music than he can with the instrumental music. Okay, do you want to listen to music? Yay, great. Before we do that, this is the Opera House Orchestra in 1920. And I believe this is Hindemith right here where the cursor is. Just right there. I don't know if you can see that, but. These are some of the selected World War I era works. If you were here early, the first piece that we were playing was Melancholie, Opus 13. And that piece was dedicated specifically to Hindemith's friend, Karl Köhler, who was in service with him and was killed in 1918. You also heard after Melancholie, Wie es wär, wenn's anders wär, which is a setting for soprano and 8 instruments. This uses a text by a poet who lived in the more mid-19th century. And the first one is in the character of Die Younger Macht, which we're going to listen a lot to. And Wie es wär kind of veers off into the absurdist, which is really interesting, I think. It gets into talking about a tree frog having a mustache, wild boars, oxes wearing hats, geese on stilts, talking about that all being peculiar, sort of demonic dances, giraffes wearing ties, and flying elephants. There are references to crocodiles in the Nile, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of, I'll play some of it for you. It's, if we want to connect this work to World War I, my suggestion would be to think of it as sort of representing the craziness of what was going on. tree frog. So he clearly had a lot of time on his hands while serving in World War I. I think that piece goes to show that Hindemith's own sort of personal emotional state was stable enough to experience happy things and to convey happy emotions while he could also convey really sort of depressing, solemn, deathly kinds of feelings, as we will get into now. So hold on for some of that. The piece that I'd like to focus on mostly today is called Die Younger Macht. It is Opus 23, number 2. It lasts about 7 minutes long, and it is it consists of 6 poem settings by Georg Trakl. Trakl was an Austrian gentleman. He was born in 1887 and died in 1914. He served in World War I for a period as a medical officer dealing with dispensing medications to people who were injured. And he kind of had a history of depression, and he killed himself, unfortunately, in 1914 because he couldn't cope with what he was witnessing. So that kind of gives a tragic spin to his poetry, unsurprising. And these poems tell the story of an anonymous young maiden who is at peril with the world, filled with destruction, war, totalitarian rule getting there, and also despair. The poetry is definitely rooted in the Expressionist movement, and we hear contrasting imagery and poetic devices that combine with text painting and a haunting musical soundscape to bring to life the sorrows of a generation of young Europeans and more broadly Germans and more broadly Europeans. There's a specific device that Hindemith uses in each of the songs, and that is sort of cyclical structure. So the musical material is kind of revolving around itself. And even though he'll have separate subject figures at certain points, one will start, the second one will start, then they'll overlap a little bit and come back to the beginning point almost consistently throughout, which is getting to that cyclical history kind of commentary. So you all have a handout, hopefully, which has some of the pages from Die Younger Macht, just to give you a sense. The basic narrative arc is that we start off with the maiden kind of getting by in life, dealing with whatever's going on, and then she falls apart from from song to song, and by the end, death has taken her away. And we kind of see the collapse, or hear the collapse. Should be the first page of your handout. Translation is up here if you'd like to see it. Great, so that gives you a taste. For my listening to this piece, I hear this movement as the woman kind of surviving and not really recognizing what's going on outside of her existence for the sake of coping. There's a lot of kind of interesting things that he does with text painting, which we're not going to get to all of them, unfortunately, just because of time. But there are moments where he will insert fluttering figures for example, in the second verse, you see here, in the beaches, jackdaws flutter. And he constructs visualizations or oral depictions of her shadow happening, or her hair fluttering, and rats screaming in the yard, etc. But what I think is really cool about this repertoire from Hindemith is that it is so gorgeous in terms of, for me at least, the mood of the music, the writing. The lyrical writing is incredible for the voices. And for my own experience of people interacting with Hindemith, I think this period gets ignored a little bit for a lot of his later work. And there are a lot of things about his later work that I think he doesn't necessarily do in this era. He's much more concise in here. It's not all about the viola. No offense to viola players, but anyways. And then this is the third verse of the first piece. And enticed by decay, she lowers her inflamed eyelids, parched grass in decay, bends down to her feet. In the second song, we get into the woman being a bit lonely. She is working in her chamber, whether that's cleaning or spinning or something like that. She's alone is the point of the story. And the text from Trockle reads here, silently she works in the chamber, and the yard lies long desolate. In the elder trees by the chamber, a blackbird flutes pitifully. Silverly her image in the mirror looks at her strangely in the twilight glow, and dusks sickly in the mirror, and she shudders before its purity. So I think here the woman is recognizing there's a change happening within herself that is starting to be apparent. Dreamlike a farm boy sings in the dark, and she stares shaken with pain. Redness trickles through the dark. Suddenly at the gate, the south wind shakes. This is the first instance in the cycle where you hear the reference to the color red, and also the farm boy. Maybe representing innocence of young people going off to war, but in fact, while they seem so familiar and charming, they're all killing each other, which is really depressing, and they will probably come for her. In that same song, Hindemith uses a rhythmic motive to depict the shaking, and he does that throughout all of the songs. Any descriptive word or adjective or whatever he's doing, there is a motive that can be associated with that. And so shaking comes back a lot through the songs. He doesn't necessarily use the same figure, but he uses something that's very obvious to the listener that can be identified. The third piece in the cycle, which you have the first page of, starts off with the clarinet. So let's get that up for you. So in the text here, which I'll pull up in a second, it describes the woman having feverish dreams. And there's all kinds of stuff going on outside that are sort of the background to her experience. And gradually the morning comes back. This is the second verse text now. You can kind of hear this representation of exhaustion where there's just like a gasp of air exhaling. And there on the word earth, it's suddenly this darker, more grounded rich kind of sound. Okay, great. On the fourth song, this is now the woman woken up from whatever the situation was, or her body sort of being there reacting to the free-verse experience and what is coming next. Lankily sprawled out on the bed. Whoop. Oh no. I spoiled the story. Sorry. The hammer clanging is now, right? So in this smithy or smithy clangs the hammer, and she scurries past the gate. In red glow, the farm boy swings the hammer, and death-like she looks over there. As in the dream, she's struck by his laughter, and she tumbles into the smithy, shyly cringing before his laughter, like the hammer hard and coarse. Brightly in the room sparks, spray, and with helpless gestures, she snatches after the wild sparks and falls dazed to the earth. So there's something about the boy and this kind of red and fire imagery that is pulling her forward, perhaps not at her own will, which probably quite obviously represents death. And this is kind of the harshest of the song settings in the cycle. I'll give you a taste of it. Noop. There it is. So there's a big transition coming that transitions back to the kind of dream state or recollection of it. And the rhythms are almost that kind of the sort of crazed laughter or nervous laughter, I think. This is now third verse, coming back to that opening figure of the hammer. So that's another song that ends with the word earth and a descent in pitch. I'll get to that. Yeah. So the fifth song, which I'm not going to play any of, gets into this is the imagery of her being in the bed. Lankily sprawled out on the bed, she wakes filled with sweet tremblings, and she sees her soiled bed hidden by a golden light. Mignonettes there at the window and the bluish brightness of sky. Sometimes the wind carries to the window a bell's hesitant tinkling. Shadows glide over the pillow, noon strikes slowly, and she breathes heavily on the pillow, and her mouth is like a wound. And then in the last song, number 6, in the evening bloody linens float, clouds over silent forests that are wrapped in black linens. Sparrows fuss in the fields, and she lies completely white in darkness. Under the roof, a cooing wafts away, like a carrion in bush, and darkness flies swirl around her mouth. Kind of dark stuff happening at the same time as the sort of reference to her being white, which, yes, it's her being dead probably, or ill, but at the same time, white is representing pure things, right? So there's this juxtaposition of the light and the darkness with that golden light that is mentioned in the previous one. And the carrion refers to kind of like carcassy stuff, which is unpleasant. So if you imagine that swirling around someone's mouth. And dreamlike in the brown hamlet, a sound of dance and fiddles echoes, floats her countenance through the hamlet, blows her hair in bare branches. We'll have you just listen to this last song. Noop. Too perky. So I think the woodwinds get to represent sort of the innocence and purity, which I'm sure they're happy about. The strings do not so much. And the strings are muted. So kind of an interesting ending. The use of the low range of the clarinet and then the cello at the end, I think, is going back to this figure that he was using in other songs where it's the earth and everything's going down at the bottom. And this is perhaps her returning to the earth or going somewhere else after the death experience. The little turn to happy at the end, I think, is probably indicative of hopefulness and a sense that the despair can be overcome, which is certainly something that Hindemith had to face on his own personal level in a very significant way in the lead up to World War II. But how do we connect this all back to the library? This definitely gives you a sense of what kind of things were happening creatively in music with European composers during World War I and in the period right after it. It was not something they could really ignore, even if they were trying to. Just in terms of the texts they were choosing to work with and in terms of what was going on in their own lives. If your father just died in combat and you had been estranged, I'm sure that's going to have some kind of effect on your psyche. And then his own service and the evolution of his beliefs about the war and German positioning politically. So Hindemith came to know Mrs. Coolidge. Yay! This is the best time to tweet about the library, right? So Mrs. Coolidge and Hindemith first became acquainted through correspondence and through Hindemith's submission for a commission competition that she used to run at the Berkshire Festival that she created. This is contemporary to her having started the series here at the library, and this is referring to 1930s specifically. Hindemith made his U.S. debut performing his own repertoire with some ensembles here at the library during the 8th Coolidge Festival in 1937, right next door. And we have, oh, I still have to put it up, the signed program from that concert, which is really cool, so I'll put that out in a second. And then the relationship continued, as you can see in some of the correspondence over here, and Hindemith was commissioned by Mrs. Coolidge on several occasions, both by her privately and by the foundation that was already at the library. And the significant one that the library commissioned was his ballet Herodiade, which was performed on the same performance as Appalachian Spring when it debuted in 1944. So that's pretty cool. This is an overview of some of the treasures related to Hindemith that are here, and most of them are on view for you. And Coolidge Foundation commissions and scores include Canon à Tre, which is a gift score to Mrs. Coolidge, the Ballet Commission Herodiade from 44, a quasi-piano concerto work called Konzertmusik for piano, Blechbläser und Harfen, which was the personal commission that Mrs. Coolidge paid for, and then a gift of a set of songs to old texts, which are down here on the bottom left. The other archive that has a lot of Hindemith stuff is the Moldenauer archives. I haven't gotten enough in depth to know if Hindemith was selling the stuff to the Moldenauers or if he was gifting it to them for other reasons. But there are some things over there that are as mundane as envelopes in which Hindemith sent goodies to the Moldenauers, which I find interesting because there are old stamps on there and German Luftpost envelopes, as well as some telegrams and little gift compositions that he made for Mrs. Coolidge on her birthday. There's one in a box that's literally composed on the box. And there's another one that's on a piece of paper, which is kind of cool. Published edition of Wie es wär, wenn's anders wär, which we heard. And there's a series of letters between Hindemith and Mrs. Coolidge about the 1930 commission for that piano work. Starting from the telegrams on the left where he has offered the commission, then when he accepts, and then going on to the exchange of money. There is the deposit check for some of the funds there, which is kind of cool. And then on the second table, there's correspondence relating to the ballet commission and the library's correspondence with him about that. This is just a small sampling of the correspondence that exists, so there's a lot of interesting stuff to delve into there. So in summary, we had a little exploration of Hindemith as a World War I musical figure. We looked at some of his works on a broad scope, and then we looked at a couple of them, especially Die Younger Macht, in detail. My hope for you is that this has piqued some interest in the World War I period and also in the musicians and the artists that were interacting with the time. and hopefully make you even more eager to go see the new exhibit that's opening in April. Now, granted, the exhibits that the library is doing are slanted towards the American participation in the war. I think with figures like Hindemith, who became so integral to American musical life in the 20th century because he lived here and taught here, and because he had a relationship with the library, I think it behooves us to think about the World War I involvement of the United States as more than just when the troops went over there. And that is that.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.